Good afternoon, everyone. Hi, thanks for joining me. I'm gonna go ahead and get started so that one, maybe we'll have time for question and answer, and two, I don't keep you past lunchtime. Um, Appreciate everyone coming through to listen to some of my work that I've been doing for what seems like ages now, but really this project has been going on for about 6 months. I'm going to talk about particularly African American political attitudes and beliefs. So before I get started, though, I am Professor Christopher Towler. I am Associate Professor in the Department of Political Science. I've been at Sac State for going on 8 years now, teaching in both political science and ethnic studies. I also am the co-editor of a Cambridge University Press journal, the Journal of Race, Ethnicity, and Politics, and the director of a series of public opinion surveys called the Black Voter Project, which is where my work today that I'll be presenting comes from. This project has been something that I started back in 2017. Coming out of graduate school, I pretty much noticed that there was very little original data on the Black community and Black voters. And everything that I was having to find was either secondary sources or things that I would have to collect myself. And so I said, well, since I'm doing this anyway, I might as well make a thing out of it. And so I started first with a pilot study in 2017. And then in 2018, I collected national data, which I then collected again in 2020 and 2022. And now culminating in a multi-wave election study in 2024, where I really have sort of a unique opportunity to collect data that really hasn't been collected in any type of way like this with the Black community since the 1980s. And so just a little information on the data project itself. It's a longitudinal study of Black public opinion. The study is intended to have 4 waves. I've collected 2 waves so far that I'll be presenting from. The first wave was fielded late March through mid-April. I surveyed a national representative sample of over 2,000 African-American respondents. Survey had an average interview length of 18 minutes, and it was balanced again on sort of age, education, gender, region, so that it's as close to census data as possible to draw generalizable conclusions. One thing that I will highlight that will be sort of a big part of the presentation is that back in April, the political landscape looked very different than it does today when it comes to the sort of horse race at the presidential stage and the enthusiasm around the presidential campaign and politics in general in the Black community. And so fortunate enough to have designed a multi-wave study where I then collected a second wave of data last month in August, which includes over 1,600 respondents, 1,100 of which are recontact interviews from the first wave. And so I was able to reach out to the same people who I interviewed in the first wave, and again in August, and get their opinions on similar topics, some different things. But the point is here, by talking to the same people, I can actually start to not just look at what has taken place, but understand why and see how attitudes have actually changed by using longitudinal data that has recontacted the same people at different points in time. And so this is what makes this project really unique. Wave 2 also includes a swing state oversample. And so I collected 450 additional new interviews in 7 swing states. I'm not going to be presenting too much on that. I'm still analyzing that data, but in total, that gives me in Wave 2 over 730 interviews in the swing battleground states for additional analysis. And so again, right, the uniqueness of this project kind of is never ending in ways that I'm really excited about. This survey is part of a 4-wave survey, as I said. So these are the first 2 waves, but I will be collecting another wave in October. So a final pre-election survey where I'll be recontacting as many people from the first 2 waves as possible. And then I'll be doing a 4th wave post-election in sort of probably early to mid-December as a way to see how people's attitudes have changed one final time following the election, however things turn out. In this project, I'm going to primarily be discussing national politics. That's the nature of the data. And I'm going to be looking at, one, what's changed between April and now when it comes to African-American views of national politics, of the political candidates? How do things such as empowerment come into play with potentially the first African-American woman president in America's history, as well as looking at turnout and what sort of can drive people to support participation in politics and engaging in politics at large. And so if we look at sort of the national political landscape as it stands today, thinking about the improved prospects overall, what we saw was that back in July, the presidential race was essentially a tie. It was back and forth between Trump and Biden, depending on which poll you looked at, but almost everything was within the margin of error. Now we have polls that are essentially and consistently putting Harris above Trump. Now, when we look at polling, national polling, we see Harris is a couple points, oftentimes 3 or more points outside of the margin of error. And a lot of that has to do with the enthusiasm and difference in African-American public opinion and attitudes over this changing time period. And as I mentioned, I do have sort of a swing state overview in the survey. But when we look at just the national polls around the swing states, again, things are pretty consistent here where it's either tied or Harris is up. Where back in April, Trump was winning in most of the swing states. And so this switch at the top of the ticket, switching from Biden to a younger African-American woman, has tremendously changed the political landscape and completely invigorated the Black community in ways that I'm happy to get into. So here, what we can look at is just the change in percentages among those that had high favorability towards either towards Kamala Harris first in April, when I asked when she was the vice president and not a presidential candidate, and then in August. And August, she is atop the ticket, right, the nominee. And what's really amazing here is that amongst every single demographic category, except for, as you'll notice, Republicans, there is a positive move, a positive increase in favorability. The percentage of people who said, we're going to rate her an 8, 9, or 10 on a 10-point scale increases, in some cases, increases quite a bit. You can see some of the largest areas. Well, overall, right, when we asked this in April, about 43% of respondents said she's an 8, 9, or 10. They have high favorability. Ask it again in August, it's up to 62%. And so just moving her out of that VP position to the top of the ticket tremendously changes the amount of Black people that view her favorably, view her highly favorably. And then when we look at some of these larger differences, what we notice is that there's not much of a gender gap, that both Black men and Black women have similar increases in favorability compared to April. And going down a little bit further, we can see that those with a high school or less education had a tremendous increase in the percent who viewed her favorably. And so again, this is a sort of sub-demographic group within the Black population that often doesn't have any data. You can't talk about these statistics in these types of ways, but what we found is that putting Harris atop the ticket has increased the likability of her, and as we'll see, enthusiasm towards her amongst those in the Black community who are not highly educated, right? Something that has been a concern for many politicians every election. How do we get these people engaged? How do we get them to actually like candidates and relate to candidates? We see, of course, Democrats have a massive jump, but so do independents. And I think this is something important to pick out, that back in April, independents actually had the least amount of people who found Harris highly favorable. That's shifted now, such that we went from 23% rating her highly favorable back in April to almost 40%, 39% here in August. And so again, this move of being a Black woman atop the ticket has influenced the Black community across the board. We also wanted to see how it moved some political and sort of identity questions. And so we asked whether or not someone disagrees with the Dobbs decision. And what we found is that those who strongly oppose the Dobbs decision, or the decision that overturned Roe v. Wade, also moved quite a bit with Harris becoming the nominee. And so issues of abortion, of reproductive rights, as we're going to see, are very important. They're a very important central issue to understanding Harris and support for her. And then finally, Black identity matters. Individuals who have a high sense of Black identity also became far more favorable of her once she was the nominee. Once people got to know her more, saw her as the nominee, the face of the Democratic Party. And then the last one is really important. We saw an increase in favorability amongst unlikely voters, or those who did not vote in 2020. And as we'll see, this is going to be really cool because about 25% of the people in the first wave who said they didn't vote at all now say they're going to vote. And so just moving her to the top of the ticket significantly increased the number of voters, or significantly moved the number of non-voters to voters within this data. All right, when we look at actual vote choice, what we can see is there's differences here. They're not quite as significant as favorability. And a lot of that has to do with prior to her becoming the nominee, there's low information. People don't know much about her. And so favorability is generally lower for politicians who are not sort of main candidates, right? And so as the VP, people are like, what do you even do as VPs? Not exactly sure, right? And so favorability tended to be a little lower. Here, we're comparing the percent of Black people that said they were going to vote for either Joe Biden back in April or Kamala Harris now in August. And what we see is that overall, back in April, about 62% of Black Americans said they were voting for Joe Biden. That jumped up 10 points to 72% in August, just with Harris being put on the ticket, right? And again, we see some of the largest jumps here. One, we do see a gender gap when it comes to voting, where women, Black women in particular, have one of the largest increases in percentage who say they'll vote for Harris based upon her becoming the nominee, right? We see that about 64% of Black women said they were voting for Biden back in April. That jumped up to 78% once it's Harris, right? And so there are gender dynamics at play here as well. We also see, again, education matters. Harris becoming the nominee has dramatically increased the vote share. She's amongst high school or less educated Black respondents, went from 53 to 68%. Independence, similar to favorability, right? Now she's at over 50% support amongst independents when it comes to the Black community. And then finally, right, we see again, Dobbs, Black identity also matter, and she moved non-voters to voters, right? She was getting about 38% of those who did not vote in 2020 said they were going to vote for Biden. Well, now it's up to 46%. Continuing to build enthusiasm, excitement, and this coalition amongst these different sub-demographics within the Black community, right? And this is something that is hardly ever talked about. We hardly ever get to talk about, well, what do these different groups within the Black community mean when it comes to support for candidates and turnout in politics, right? The Black community is often seen as homogeneous, where really we have such heterogeneity in here. Interestingly enough, she actually also increased support amongst Black Republicans. Not much, right? But there's something there, putting her at the top of the ticket. And as I'm looking more into the data, right, my hunch is this has to do with racial identity and the need of some Black Republicans to possibly vote against their party's candidate because they want to see the first Black woman become president. All right, next, I want to look at turnout. And so here we're looking at the percent of respondents who said they will definitely vote in the presidential election in November. Again, we're looking at the percent who said they would definitely vote when Biden was the candidate back in April to now Harris being the candidate in August. Overall, we see a 9% increase here. 58% said they were going to definitely vote back in April compared to 67% in August. Of note, in 2020, average national turnout for Black Americans was 62.3%. So moving from Biden to Harris has actually increased Black turnout, the likelihood of Black turnout above the 2020 average, where prior to that, with Biden on the ticket, it was below. And turnout was going to be a major question, right? I think when we look at battleground states, turnout still is a question because certain states had higher turnout rates than the national average. For example, 2020, Black turnout in Pennsylvania was at about 70%, right? Almost 8 points higher than the national average. So there's still right? Questions as to whether or not how this translates to different battleground states. And, this data will provide some insight there. But we also see here amongst women, right? Women actually had relatively low turnout compared to men when it came to Biden, but now the gender gap is eliminated. Black men and Black women participating high rates under Kamala Harris. We don't see much movement here amongst the youngest population, those under 40. And this is really interesting, right? Because what we've seen is that there's actually been massive registration efforts. And that's not going to show up here, because what we're doing here is we're interviewing or surveying people who are already sort of in the electorate, who have been identified as voters, who are part of panels, who are on calling lists, right? So the new registrants here are not going to be in this data. They're not going to be captured. And so I'm hoping that even though we don't have much of a finding here, right, there's going to be some increase in young Black voters amongst the new registration that's taking place. We again see a dramatic shift in turnout, likelihood to vote amongst those that have a high school or less education. So the sort of least educated cohort in the Black community. Independence, massive jump. And then Dobbs, like abortion issues matter, as well as Black identity. Some slight movement here amongst non-voters, right? But that's expected. Any movement there is helpful and great. All right, so what we've looked at so far is what's happened. We've looked at the differences, at how percentages have changed, at how different subgroups within the Black community have become either more enthusiastic or more engaged in politics since we've moved from Biden to Harris at the top of the ticket. We can see some of the effect descriptively on the Black community moving to a Black candidate, in this case, the first African-American woman to hold a major party ticket nomination. The uniqueness of this data, though, allows us to move from the what happened to why did this happen. And by actually running models where I look at change over time, comparing how someone felt in wave one to their feelings in wave two, while also controlling for a host of other factors, I can start to take a look at why some of these things matter. Why did favorability increase so much? Why has turnout jumped amongst certain groups? And so what I find is that amongst approval or favorability, one of the main things that matter is this idea of threat. And I'm going to get into this a bit more, but what we look at is, just like we saw movement among those who disapproved of Dobbs, this idea of abortion and the threat to abortion rights is one of the most significant reasons why Black enthusiasm has increased under Harris and why turnout has increased as well. We also see that the threat here of Trump and sort of the MAGA movement also has been pushing people to be more engaged in politics and more enthusiastic about politics, as well as things such as economic anxiety. When we look at actual vote share, again, similar themes, right? Here we see threat, abortion, and even some gender dynamics. And when we look at increased likelihood to vote, we again see threat and then some identity issues. So if we look more specifically at it, what we have here are multivariate model results comparing attitudes from wave one in some cases to outcomes in wave two. The outcome here is feelings towards Harris in August. So that final outcome that we've been discussing. What we can see is that when we plug in each one of these different factors or possibilities, we can see whether or not they have a significant effect from zero by whether or not the tail here around these estimates is crossing this zero line. So anywhere the tail separates itself from the zero line, we can say that there is statistical significance there, and we have a real relationship, something that's worth talking about. Clearly, how you felt about Harris in wave one back in April dramatically affects how you feel about her in wave two. Those who had strong feelings about her in wave one also have strong feelings about her in wave two. And it's very, very strong because there's very small error around it. There's very little error around it. When we look at whether or not you think the threat of Trump has increased over time, we see that also significantly predicts warm feelings towards Harris from wave one to wave two. Meaning, as Harris became the candidate, you became more favorable towards her if you also thought there was a great threat having to do with Trump and also the MAGA movement. Here we see abortion threat. We asked about whether or not you thought abortion bans were a threat to you in the Black community. And what we see is those who think abortion bans are threatening also increased their favorability. And so what I take away from this, and I'll talk about towards the end, right, is that Harris represents a greater protection to these threats than Biden did. And when we look at Harris as the candidate, these factors are more likely to influence people to support her or have warm feelings towards her than they did when she was not the candidate, right? Than when Biden was the candidate. Here we see being a Republican pushed you in the opposite direction. So if you were GOP and Harris became the ticket, you're less likely to feel favorable to her than Biden. And then anxious of the economy. If you're anxious of the country's economy, you're also less likely to feel favorable towards Harris than Biden when she took the ticket. And so here we can kind of see some of these relationships play out. When we look at the probability that these things actually influenced someone's favorability towards Harris, we can see that here on a scale of magnitude, how much these things influenced one's change in favorability. Again, whether or not you were favorable towards Harris in the first wave was the strongest predictor of favorability in wave 2. But then we could see right around here, we also see significant influence, right, amongst threat and abortion. And so this idea of reproductive rights and abortion and threat are central to understanding Black support for Harris, right? And as I believe they'll be central to her continuing to build Black support and build her coalition of support as she finishes off her campaign and rounds things out come November. Again, and then we have a negative push here, right? We're on the other side of zero now, such that being conservative and being anxious of the economy actually pushed you to feel less favorable about Harris. All of the other factors that we talked about in the other model and the descriptives, right, were not significant. Meaning these are the primary reasons why Black people became more favorable of Harris from April to August. Everything else was a wash, meaning when you put it in a model and you account for error and you take into consideration the influence that each one of these factors have on favorability, this is what matters. This is what matters. It's threat and primarily abortion threat. When looking at vote choice, similar story. Here you can see if you were going to vote for Biden, yep, significantly going to vote for Harris as well. Disapproval of MAGA, yes, and abortion threat, yes, as well, right? It's very slim here, but we'll look at magnitude in a second. But what we see here is that absolutely, right? If you think abortion is a threat to you, if an abortion ban is threatening to you, you're more likely to actually vote for Harris more so than Biden. Being female, women more likely to vote for Harris than Biden compared to men. And then again, similar relationship down here where if you're Republican, you're less likely to vote for Harris than Biden. And so there is sort of an inverse relationship between Black Republicans and Harris becoming the nominee. But again, that's not necessarily a big part of the story. I know there's been a lot of sort of misinformation out there about how much of the Black community is going to vote for Trump, is conservative, is Republican, but in my best estimates, right, it's no more than historical averages. It's not going to be more than the 11, 12% that we've consistently seen over the last 10 years. Again, when looking at magnitude, what we see here is that whether you're going to vote for Biden significantly predicts whether you're going to vote for Harris, and similar throughout, right? Here we have abortion and MAGA all playing similar roles. All right, lastly, looking at turnout. So here, predicting whether or not you will say you're definitely going to vote in November. Look at this. Barely anything pushed people. What pushes people? Well, whether you're going to vote in wave 1, of course, if you say you're definitely going to vote in April, you're way more likely to say you're definitely going to vote in August, right? That's a strong relationship. But here, the threat of Trump is one of the few things that actually pushes people to vote for Harris over Biden. Moving people into the electorate, moving people from maybe will vote, I will not vote, I'm not sure, to definitely will vote months later, right, with Harris as the nominee. And then also an interesting finding here, those who were born outside the U.S., African-Americans, or not African-Americans, but Black people who identified as foreign-born were actually less likely to vote once Harris became the nominee. And so all this talk about Harris not being Black, about her being South Asian, isn't really bearing out when it comes to attitudes towards the Black community, right? We're not seeing a strong foreign-born identity associated with a vote for, for Harris here. And when we look at magnitude, again, we see certain to vote here, right? massive, massive relationship between those who are certain to vote. But again, there is some increase here, some 5% increase between whether or not you feel Trump is a threat and if you are to vote for Harris. Last thing I want to talk about, and then we should have plenty of time for question and answer, is whether or not we can persuade Black people to actually support one party or the other. And so at the end, well, inside of the experiment, inside of the survey, I embedded a experiment where I asked people, first off, do you agree or disagree with this question? Black people must support the Democratic Party. And then depending on how they answered that question, I gave them some message primes or framing to try and convince them to change their mind. And so if you said you agreed, you would get certain questions that were negative about either Kamala Harris or about the Democratic Party trying to have you change your mind. Or if you disagreed, you got some positive framing. Or in this case, you got one positive framing discussing Harris's role as the first Black woman to represent the Democratic Party in a presidential election, or you got a framing about Donald Trump and threat. And this goes back to, years and years of research showing that threat is something that we should be taking into consideration. And because of the way that national politics changed and pushed Harris to the top of the ticket, we can actually look at, the comparison of threat versus this empowerment frame, and whether or not there are any differences between how threat might influence someone, in this case, to support the Democrats versus just this idea of empowerment and having a Black candidate on the ticket. And so of those that took the survey, 594 disagreed. So 37% disagreed with this statement, this initial statement, and then they received one of these two primes randomized following this question. After they received one of these primes, they were then asked another statement. Now that you've received this information, do you agree or disagree that you should support the Democratic Party? What we find is that among those who received the Trump prime, the threat prime, 40% changed their mind. 20% moved to somewhat agree, 20% moved to strongly agree that Black people must support the Democratic Party, compared to only about 20% of those that received the empowerment prime. This message about Harris being the first Black woman to hold the Democratic nomination. Here we can see that 14% moved from disagree to somewhat agree, and only 6% moved to strongly agree. And so again, I think what we're looking at here are dynamics beyond sort of this idea that, one, Black people won't just always vote for Black people. There's a lot of research and literature that suggests that happens when there's a first. And so when we look at Obama breaking through that glass ceiling, brought out emotions and a sense of empowerment that we might not ever see again, even with another Black nominee, even with another Black candidate on the ticket. It's that first that really does it, right? Harris is going to have to find other ways to appeal to the Black community beyond just her racial identity and sort of the historic nature of her candidacy. We did see gender play a role, especially when it came to vote choice. But when it comes to getting people out to the polls, right, it's really going to be about this idea of threat and highlighting the differences between her and Donald Trump and the MAGA movement in the Black community, specifically highlighting how Trump will hurt the community and she can protect from that, right? And other work I've done shows it's a hard case to show that she might help the Black community. We're having a lot of those conversations in California right now around the issue of reparations and what it looks like to actually have Democrats push for legislation and policies that are beneficial to the Black community. But she can absolutely make the case that she's not going to hurt the Black community. She can protect the Black community from further denigration and disintegration of rights that Donald Trump wants to pursue. And so again, to summarize, right, Black voters matter, especially in the swing states. And we've seen that by putting Harris at the top of the ticket, Black voters have changed completely changed the political landscape, right? Turnout is now above 2020 averages amongst Black voters, and support for her is also above or right about at 2020 averages when it comes to both, it's way above favorability, right? We haven't ever seen any shifts in favorability like this in the history of politics, right? The amount of change in favorability towards Harris, not just among Black folks, but among the entire electorate, is historical. But the vote shift, the change in vote share has also made it so that it's a competitive election again, and Harris actually holds a slight lead in a number of the battleground states. Interestingly enough, though, this isn't explained by her being Black. It's mostly explained by threats, significantly the threat that Trump and the MAGA movement represent to the Black community, but then also this threat to abortion rights, this threat of the Dobbs decision and eliminating Roe v. Wade. And so Harris has an opportunity here to capitalize on these things and make sure that she highlights what she stands for when it comes to abortion rights, how she can protect reproductive rights and continue to fight against these threats, right? Because in many ways, they're one and the same, right? There is some significant difference between these, but there's a way to make an argument that if you protect against Trump, if you protect against MAGA, you're also protecting against assaults on reproductive rights and abortion rights. And then finally, even with Harris as the candidate, right, the threat of Trump, rather than her significance, historical candidacy is actually more convincing when it comes to trying to get Black people to support the Democrats, to support party politics, to actually become party faithfuls, right? And so, there's a cautionary tale here, and there was an article released just yesterday that said, so far out of the Harris campaign, all of the media spending, only 1% has been targeted to the Black community. And so there's a cautionary tale here that there might be some way to motivate and energize Black people by focusing on abortion, but it's probably not going to work by doing just abortion alone. You have to have really targeted ads, targeted campaigning to engage the Black community, to get them into the fold, out there and voting in ways that don't necessarily rely upon her being the second Black president, the second Black candidate. And if you don't do that and you try and rely on her identity alone, it might not work, right? It might be a very uphill battle. So that's what I have. I'm happy to take any and all questions we have. And please enjoy the food and the rest of your lunch. Thank you.
Thank you very much. This is quite fascinating, and glad to hear it. I was struck by the data with regard to foreign-born Blacks. Can you shed a bit more light on what could be? I mean, definitely a majority will be, but not as high as the non-foreign-born. And I'm wondering what are some variables that could be explaining that? And I want to believe that these are people that know for sure that are eligible to vote. Correct? In that regard.
That's not for certain. So one of the elements that I pushed hard for in this research is to collect a representative sample of the general population, not of just registered voters, not of just likely voters, so that we can see those dynamics. Because if you just collect registered voters, you're probably not going to have a large enough foreign-born sample, even with this type of data set, to actually say anything, right? And so when I see that finding, there's absolutely much more that can be looked into there. But to me, what it's essentially saying is that compared to African Americans, foreign-born Black people are less likely to feel energized around Kamala Harris's candidacy, right? And that it's really her Black identity that is doing all the work when it comes to mobilizing people, and that's particularly affecting Black Americans more so than foreign-born people, right? As far as and that specific finding was for getting out to vote, right, and registering to vote. And so there absolutely could be other factors coming into play there, as far as maybe they do not have citizenship, right? They are not eligible voters in ways that would make it impossible for them to be energized to get out to vote, even with Harris as the candidate.
Yeah, and Marco, I'm thinking of some of the specific issues that may be of interest to the foreign-born Blacks. I know there's some of the charts that I've been privy to. In fact, there is a forum this evening on what is called kind of immigrant hate speech. And there's a kind of a certain sense as to whether she really needs to push back a bit more about who is eating who or what,
That's always a caveat with data, is that this data was collected in the beginning of August, before the whirlwind of conspiracy theories about Haitian immigrants and even Venezuelan immigrants in Colorado, to the point where this might change, right? And when I collect data in October, it'll be really interesting to see if this finding stands. or if after this, right, we do see more the differences disappear between foreign born and African American or American born blacks when it comes to their interest in participating. Um, I do agree with you, though. I think that it depends on what the Harris campaign does, and I'm not necessarily sure they've made strong enough statements pushing back against this. Right, there was a lot of calls for her to go visit Springfield, Ohio, and actually talk with the community there in light of the conspiracy theories going on. But that never happened. So again, it's more of an empirical question that I'm excited to actually have the opportunity to try and answer now.
Thank you very much.
Hello, thank you so much for presenting this and really taking the time to focus on it. Um, my question is a bit nuanced, so you might not be able to answer it, but
I'll try.
Um, so you talked a lot about how the threat of Trump is more convincing than this empowerment message that I think they're running with. Um, and my question is, I've heard just like online, social media, also just like from people that I know, uh, that they just don't feel like they can relate to Kamala Harris. And I think that it's coming from this sense of like, she's like too much of a minority. Like that's the conversation I'm hearing is she black? How black is she? Because to your point, Obama was the first, but now you have a black South Asian woman, and she's a woman, she's black and South Asian.
Obama was mixed too, right?
Right. Which is always my response. So looking at the data, do you think that that is maybe a piece of why people are responding less to the empowerment?
That's a great question. It is very nuanced, but I can draw on previous research to try and help answer this one. In that I didn't present it here, but what we found is that most of the people who came out of the fold to either support or vote for Harris before, from April when Biden was a candidate to now, were people who were not voting or not strong voters before. And so the likely voters, you do see some shifts there, but it's not as pronounced as those who are unlikely voters or who are non-voters or who weren't planning on voting in April, right? And so I think that's why the Trump message resonates more than anything else, because specifically those voters who are not likely voters who get brought back into the fold, our research has shown that the threat frame is more convincing than anything else. Because there's a reason they're unlikely voters. They're alienated, they're apathetic, they don't see anything in the parties for them, right? They don't necessarily believe politics will bring them any benefits. And so making a case for a Democratic candidate that's going to pass legislation that's going to help them is very difficult, right? When they've gone most of their lives, especially if they're, in their 30s, believing that that's not the case, that that'll never happen. So when you use threat, you don't have to rely upon sort of engaging those policy questions or those really difficult answer those really difficult questions about why hasn't it happened yet, right? Why haven't the Democrats done this yet? You can rely upon a protective mindset and sort of activating in anger within a political energy that pushes people to participate to protect what they have, right? A gains versus loss calculation rather than a complete gains calculation. And so from my best estimate, that's what's going on here, is that most of this threat is activating the unlikely voters and bringing them into the fold either to vote or to support Harris, right, or both. And that's why it's so powerful, more so than sort of empowerment. But we did see black identity, right? Does matter. And so it's not just about unlikely versus likely voters. You have to have a certain particular kind of voter. And we saw that black Republican support actually decreased when it came to favorability. And so if you have a black Republican, and typically when you look at the ideological spectrum within the black community, Michael Dawson has, seminal work on this in Black Visions. It suggests that black conservatives downplay their black identity, that they want to see themselves as more non-racial or post-racial or colorblind, if you will. And so that identity piece matters here for also interpreting what might be going on with this threat piece, where it's really, really salient with people who also see themselves as centrally black to their personal identity. That help? Great question.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So I noticed that on a lot of the probability charts of how much each of these factors affect whether or not someone views Harris favorably or is more likely to vote because of that the error bars on the age group were pretty big in some of them. Why could you explain a little why that was? Was the sample size just not very big, or was there a lot of variance?
I think one, yes, because it's very hard to get young people to do surveys, period. So trying to get young, like 18 to 24-year-old black people to do a survey is next to impossible. And so we actually stayed in the field an extra week trying to balance the sample out as much as we could. So when you look at the top lines and crosstabs, those are weighted, right? So you're going to see a more balanced representation. But when modeling it, we have to rely upon the data we have. And yes, we did not have as many of the youngest cohort within the sample as is commonly most often the case, right? And so that's why those error bars were large enough. But I think, you know, there's a lot of data here. It's not like we're working with, 50, 60 people. Even within this subsample, I think there were over 300 people that were in this cohort of like 18 to 29 years old, which means that there's just error there, right? There's just uncertainty. And that makes sense as well when you know that young people also have not necessarily formed as sturdy political opinions. Their opinions sway more, right? It's harder to convince them of things, to get them into the fold, to participate. And so it does fit with what we know about sort of political science literature and research as well. Um, it's interesting though, right? You would think age would matter right now. It doesn't though when you account for these other things. And so again, if you just look at the top lines and crosstabs, you might see some differences amongst the age groups. But then when you start putting it into a model where you're also accounting for strength of Black identity, you're also accounting for where you stood on these political issues 5 months ago in April, right? You're also accounting for how you feel about abortion. Age becomes less important.
That's really interesting.
Yeah, great question. We go to, you'll email me, right?
Hello. So one of the major themes of the DNC was the push to get involved and take an action rather than just voting, but take previous actions to get people to vote. And one of the main differences we're seeing on the ground in the States is the Trump campaign has not emphasized a ground game as much, such as canvassing or other things. I'm curious if you had any questions relating to other actions than voting, such as any form of mobilization, whether that be canvassing or such, because if the data didn't show any needle moving and getting out to vote, I'm curious if the needle moved on mobilization in any way.
That's a good question. We did ask about petitioning, about going to meetings, about doing boycotts. So there are other sort of non-traditional ways to participate surveyed on there. But again, I have to do that analysis. I have to really take a close look at that, right? Right now, I think all the emphasis is on voting. I think one of the reasons why the Trump campaign has not invested in such a ground game is on one hand, right, there's a lack of funds, it seems like they're running out of money. But two, in a lot of the places where Black voters are a significant amount of the population to make a difference, there's state and local officials running sort of vote suppression efforts. I just read today the state of North Carolina just expunged or removed over 750,000, almost 750,000 voters from the voter rolls, right? And as we know from research that those removals of voters typically overrepresent, people of color, Black people. And so those efforts are going on simultaneously with everything we're talking about here, which makes these turnout numbers that much more important, right? And so we have to understand this is sort of taking place not in a vacuum, but there's a whole lot of other things going on when we look at these strategies. And my work is really just designed to push people to think about Black voters more as a central purpose of the campaign rather than sort of an ancillary cost that you can throw a little money at come at the end of October. But again, so much data I have to get to it. So
I guess I have the mic. Thank you again for this presentation. It's really interesting. I guess my question was sort of somewhat related also to how you think the debate is going to show up in your data come October. My question specifically, I guess, was related to, you're finding that messages of threat move people more. I'm curious if you have thoughts on how, you know, the recent attempt on Donald Trump's life and the conversations, some people are having on, rhetoric turning up, is showing up, is going to show up in any way on.
So we did ask questions about that on the second wave about whether or not the assassination attempt influenced your view of Trump, about whether or not you watched the debate. And this was the first debate, mind you. Most people did not watch the debate. Only a few did, and then a few more followed it online, like watched clips. And so we have a long line of literature that says debates don't really matter. We might see something unique here because of the switch in the candidates in the middle of the campaign. That's unique. That never happens, right? The last time that happened was like in the 1920s. So the fact that we have this historical moment might cause more interest in the debate, but my hunch is that it's not going to matter much, right? And then when looking at Black attitudes towards the assassination of Trump, over 50% majority said it didn't change their opinion, that it did not matter whatsoever. And most Black people do not want to see a felon elected president. And they do not feel like him having a felony bolsters his case with the Black community whatsoever at all. So all of these sort of GOP talking points are completely erased when you actually look at Black attitudes using good data that really can dig into those things without relying upon just 130 or 150 responses in a larger survey. So
yeah, thanks for that.
Thank you. I love all of the data that you have collected here, and I know it's no small task, so I really appreciate all of this. I want to go back to the messaging here and the Trump threat. It's really interesting to me because Trump has always been there as a threat, right? I mean, throughout the whole campaign. So it's interesting that that is something that has shifted with the change in the candidates. And especially because Biden was really emphasizing Trump as a threat and democracy as a threat and is threatened in January 6th. And that was his primary messaging. And Harris has seemed to step away from that and wanting to do more of this empowering kind of messaging.
Obama change in hope, right?
Right. So I guess, I mean, should she not do that? Should she be going back to just this kind of threat messaging that Biden was using? Yeah, but I guess then the Trump threat, is that just the threat that he might be back in office? Or when you say that it's the Trump threat, all of that other stuff is in it, right? That, well, abortion rights might be even more restricted, or I mean, all the immigrant threats that he is running on, things like that, I mean, it's all kind of together, right? So what do you mean by the by the Trump threat? And then I guess, should Harris be going back to the threat messaging that Biden was using? Would you recommend?
That's a great question. I'm again rely on other research I've done to help answer this. What I found in the past is that just like everyone else in America, vast majority of Black people don't really pay attention to politics every day, right? We're nerds. We're unique in here, that we're here listening to this and spending our extra time caring about this. Most people don't, right? And they might open Facebook and get an ad, and that's their political engagement for the day. And then they go back to like puppy memes. So when it comes down to actually understanding the threat that Trump represents, people are not thinking about this all day, every day, like some of us are. And so it really takes a message to activate that idea that then changes people's opinions and attitudes and potentially gets them out to participate, right? And additional research I've done also shows that the threat is most effective when it's framed as a threat to the Black community. So when you highlight things about Trump, about his policies, about his campaigns that are specifically threatening to the Black community, such as police immunity, rollback of voting rights, using military to break up protests, right? Banning Black studies. When you highlight these things that are specifically threatening to the Black community, that's what makes it powerful. And a generic message about Trump as a threat to democracy doesn't really do it. A message about Trump as an economic threat doesn't really do it. It has to be a threat to the community, which is why we see abortion working here too, because abortion gets wrapped up in these ideas of rights. In focus groups I've done over the last couple of years, when people talk about why abortion matters to them, Black people in particular, they say, well, because what's next, right? If I don't have my right to abortion, then I'm not going to have right to IVF. I'm not going to have right to contraceptive. Eventually, we're not going to have the even right to get married. Interracial marriage will be banned, right? They'll roll back legislation from 50 years ago. And so that is really, really the crux here. And so for the Harris campaign, right, clearly there has to be more targeted investment in the Black community, not just media, but ground game, going to doors, spending money for local campaigns to get involved, right? Having PACs spend money to get people out there talking face to face with people. That's shown to be the most effective mobilizing technique in talking about these issues in this way, right? So you got to have the money to get out there and do it, and then you got to have the right message. We'll see.
Do you think that if the Harrison-Walz administration takes a look at the playbook that was done for the 2022, I think Georgia Senate race with Stacey Adams, I think was her name, where I think it was Georgia where they took away the registration offices and they limited to specific spots in the state. She went around campaigning in Georgia, try to get more Black voters. And I think she upped the number, even though she lost the governor's race, she did improve the number. Do you think if the Harrison and Walz administration does that in like not just in Georgia, but swing states around the country, could that up the?
I think so. I think, Abrams' campaign in Georgia is why Georgia turned blue in 2020. It was because of she started this ground game for her governor's race in 2018, back in 2014 and 15, right? And so it was almost a decade of mobilizing the Black community across Georgia that eventually turned the state blue, right? She's no longer a major political candidate. It's unclear what her political future is. There's still some elements of that, right? Black voters matter. Keep Georgia blue campaign still working in the state, but it's not as targeted. It's not as strong of an investment as it was in the past. And so we'll see, but I absolutely think that's what needs to happen, right? It's just a little late in the game, right? This really should have been happening back in April when Biden was the nominee, if they were serious about having Black voters be, turning the tide in some of these battleground states. I think North Carolina is another state now, especially with the controversy around the gubernatorial candidate, the GOP governor, where if there's significant investment in a strong ground game, that state could be blue, right? For the first time since 2008, I think. And so it's pretty crazy, but again, it's unlikely to happen the way that I would want it to, right? I'm hoping that we see some investment, but if you don't get that, the other benefit of getting that significant investment is you could potentially bring people into the fold to vote that will vote for the rest of their lives. And that's really what this is about, is getting as many people active and engaged in politics as possible so that the Black community especially has a long-lasting and enduring political voice. And it's not just like every 4 years or every close election or we need a Black candidate, right? It needs to be a continuous effort, hopefully by both parties, to do that.
And one more question. Do you think with the most recent Missouri execution of Marcellus Williams, if the Harrison, if she makes a statement, whether even condemning the governor or her thoughts of it, do you think that can even provoke more people to vote for her? She's like, Stacey,
Yeah, so here's where it gets tricky, because the Democrats have to have a very sort of delicate coalition of liberal and moderate whites, progressive Latinos, underrepresented communities, right? Asian Americans, and then the overwhelming support of the Black community just to compete. And so when Harris makes statements or does speeches, she has to be very sort of PC, if you will, so that she doesn't upset one part of the coalition at the sake of trying to pander to another, right? And that's why I feel like the targeted media buys, the targeted campaigning, the ground game is where it has to be, because she's not going to be able to come out and make a statement on every sort of controversial issue that happens to try and engage the Black community, because she's going to turn off different parts of the coalition, right? Or risk losing working class white union workers in Pennsylvania. And that's, she's not going to do that. She's not going to break that part of the coalition. And so again, it's really about the way that the campaigns focus their spending and energy, right, this last month or so till election day. Yeah. question?
So I know we're talking about the rhetoric a lot here, but I really want to use your expertise to help me make sense of something that's confusing me a lot, because I guess it's always made sense to me. I know that the literature does show that the threat rhetoric works a lot. Like that's not new. That's very, and it's a big debate. But I guess my question is, why are they choosing to run a more empowerment rhetoric? And I'm curious if you know, based off your expertise, if the empowerment method mobilizes people better, and does the empowerment rhetoric create more quality voters, even if less quantity? Because if the question is how do we mobilize people out to a ground game, does the empowerment create people who like vote for the rest of their lives rather than just one-time voters? I'm wondering if you know a difference in the quality of that, or
No, that's a good question. There is recent research in the last 5 years that suggests that voters who are voting based out of inspiration and empowerment are not only more likely to vote, but are more likely to continue to vote, right? Versus the threat and anxiety model, right? The problem is you have to have very, very specific circumstances for the empowerment model to work. And as I'm finding here, even Kamala Harris might not offer those circumstances, right? Her candidacy might not be enough to actually have that empowerment model take hold more so than a threat and sort of anger, anxiety model. In the short run, right, I think the goal is to get as many people out to vote as possible. I think the Harris campaign in most Democrats probably shy away from the threat messaging because in doing so, it doesn't necessarily fit the sort of moral underpinnings that the Democratic Party has rested upon for so long. And there are calls to change that, right? There's been a lot of calls that you can't keep going high when they go low. You have to fight fire with fire. I think there's an opportunity in this moment to use threat for short-term gains to potentially have long-term outcomes where you can work towards empowerment. And a lot of literature on political allegiance and support suggests that things like trust in systems isn't going to change overnight, right? It takes years and years, decades or generations to actually change levels of support to build up that institutional confidence, if you will. And so, but the first step is to get people engaged in participating, right? And if you get people participating, they start to see their elected representatives win. They start to see their elected representatives be reelected, become incumbents, and then they start to see policy repercussions and redistribution, and they actually see the rewards of that. Then you start to see that institutional support and confidence build up again. So it's really like a short game strategy for long-term gains, right? But I think it's really tough to tell the Democratic Party right now, you're not going to convince people that you're good enough, right? You have to move to the other direction. Nobody wants to hear that. Nobody wants to move away from this. Oh, people aren't good. We can't appeal to them. We just can't do it, right? When in many cases, that's it, right? Black people have been alienated, rightfully so, for so many reasons over, decades and decades, if not centuries, at least, since the 1960s, right? There have been countless reasons as to why Black people do not trust politics, do not trust political parties. Still, you're not going to get a lot of politicians that are going to admit to that are going to admit that they're not able to convince people to vote for them.
Thanks.
You briefly mentioned that there were some like conditions that makes that sort of empowerment model work. What are some of those in your experience?
Well, so far, the only place nationally we've seen that work is with Obama, right? We don't have any other examples of empowerment at the presidential level other than Barack Obama's historic run to become the first non-white, quote, Black president in our country's history. We do see that working at state and local levels more often, though, right? And so we have models of Harold Washington in Chicago becoming the first Black mayor, really using an empowerment model to change his campaign into a social movement in ways that brought people into the political fold that would never even thought about politics before, right? And winning the mayorship of Chicago handily, defeating the political machine there that had been in power for 60 years, right? We see this in LA as well with Tom Bradley using an empowerment model, but building a coalition in LA in different ways, right? But using his identity as a Black former police chief in this case, right? To appeal to Black people to become the first Black mayor of LA, while also maintaining a sort of multiracial liberal coalition, if you will. And so one key thing has really is you got to be the first, right? That's where empowerment's so successful. And then two, you have to make appeals to the Black community that you are going to benefit the community as a whole, like racial appeals, right? And that's really, as we just said, that's really hard to do at the national level. We've already seen, just in the state of California, how difficult it is to make appeals on things such as reparations, one of the most sort of favorable policies within the Black community. And so to ask a presidential candidate to do that is sort of bewildering. Even Obama didn't really do that, right? When you think about what Obama discussed on the campaign trail, it was very deracialized and very colorblind, if you will. I think we're all good. Thank you so much. Please enjoy food and snacks before you leave. Happy to talk to anyone else before we get out of here.